The Saw series started out as a fever dream project for film students James Wan and Lee Winnell, but has since developed into a whole franchise of gore. The central villain, Jigsaw, initially presented himself as a non-serial killer who just wanted to force troubled people into appreciating and fighting for their lives. But as the series went on, his games eventually made it clear that he and his minions just wanted to see people suffer. As a result, some installments definitely turned out better than others. From worst to first, here's a ranking of all the Saw movies so far.
Let the game begin.
Saw 3D, the final chapter. By the time the 7th piece of the Jigsaw puzzle came into play, this series looked almost nothing like the original. In the pic, Detective Hoffman was so busy running around cleaning up his own messes that the day's game seemed like an afterthought meant only to follow formula. In fact, there were 2 major group traps that were completely devoid of value to the overarching plot. Whoever thought it was necessary to have a man rip all the skin off his back in 3D might just be sicker than Jigsaw. There were a couple elements of redemption, like Dr. Gordon making a long overdue comeback to the series to tie up a few loose limbs, and there was a kernel of something interesting in play with the fake Jigsaw survivor at the center. But the movie was frustratingly disjointed, and Hoffman's Terminator-style raid on the police department laid waste to the entire framework of Jigsaw's legacy. Saw 3. The third installment of the Saw series was one of the most problematic for several reasons. For starters, the victims were completely sympathetic and even less deserving of their fates than anyone else. Submitting the father and mother of a drunk driving victim to torture trials just because they're not grieving the way you might want them to, that's cruel, even for Jigsaw. Even worse was the fact that the new traps for this installment were unnecessarily gruesome, to the point of being unwatchable at times. And let's not forget about the table saw brain surgery we just had to watch unfold. Sure, it was a clever turn of fortune that the person who was really being tested was protege number 1, Amanda. But the choice of victims here seemed to exhaust the whole generous Grim Reaper identity that Jigsaw crafted for himself in the previous picks, making Saw 3 among the series' slackest chapters. Saw 6. Whereas Saw 5 managed to make Detective Hoffman interesting, Saw 6 did not. Since he'd already killed off Strom, and the spate of drug addicts and other officers who'd run afoul of Jigsaw were all dead as well, Hoffman's victims list became pretty arbitrary and ridiculous.
Do you like how brutality feels, Mark?
This time, he picked on a pair of predatory loan sharks and one particularly nasty insurance adjuster who denied John Kramer coverage for some experimental cancer treatments. Bearing in mind the fact that this movie was released in the wake of the subprime mortgage crisis, it's understandable why the filmmakers might try to get political and punish greedy people. However, the plot was still flimsy and underexplored and seemed extra gruesome just for the sake of shock value. Combined with some terrible acting and forced twists, it became stock schlock long before the timer ran out. The redeeming factor of the movie that keeps it from landing last on the list is that Hoffman's voyeuristic copycat game in the beginning was a pretty decent metaphor for the Saw series as a whole. Saw 4. For the 4th installment, director Darren Lynn Bousman decided to delve into John Kramer's wretched rationale by bringing in his tragic story with his wife into the picture, along with another secondary psycho to fill in the timeline gaps as John Kramer took his leave of the world. But the central player of the games, Lieutenant Rigg, was wholly undeserving of his trial. So what if he was passionate about his job and missed out on a family vacation or two? The punishment never really matched the crime in this series, but especially so for Rigg. That said, the clever culmination of events at the end was a fresh surprise that saved this story. The fact that Jigsaw was still in control of his crew, even while lying cold on an autopsy table, was delightfully bonkers and managed to renew any fading interest in what was next. Saw 5. By the time we got to the 5th film, it was Detective Hoffman who'd taken over Jigsaw's kill crew. He was sloppy enough to attract some heat from on high in the form of FBI Special Agent Strom. Strom was obsessively committed to the cause of nailing his prime suspect even after escaping his own death trap by way of an ink pen tracheotomy. So, the game of cat and mouse that ensued between them was pretty epic. Meanwhile, the games that were afoot in Saw 5 were also a bit more precise and interesting. The victims of this round weren't just helplessly being ripped to shreds, but instead at least pretended to use their brains before engaging those mechanisms that would cause their eventual demise. The gore of the games was mercifully dialed down a notch, which gave more room for the sound effects team to fill in the blanks, rather than always leaning on graphic visuals to get the job done. This film's return to a teamwork element in the games was refreshing, and the passionate pursuit of Strom culminated in a crushing twist ending that was as jaw-dropping as anything that came before it or after. Saw 2. Director Darren Lynn Bousman managed to avoid the sophomore slump with the first sequel to Saw. In fact, the film gamely expanded the world that had been established in the original and offered a new vein of intrigue for the subsequent sequels to float on. The backbone of the selected group of victims, stuck in a dirty doom house where they're racing against the clock to flesh out their own shared histories, was still there. But the movie managed to layer that element in a compelling subplot about Jigsaw's arresting officer, Detective Matthews, and his missing son. And on top of that, there was the surprise return of Amanda, which answered the question of what would actually happen to those few who managed to survive Jigsaw's game. Unlike some of the other sequels, the entire plot was pretty polished and managed to give the series some staying power. So, movie 2 is the second best of the series. Saw. There was something very artful about Saw's approach to the macabre that made the movie such an indelible experience. The puzzle pieces of skin taken from victims' bodies were meant to be symbols of what was missing from people's lives, but they were also a collective metaphor for the audience's job of digesting everything that happened in the film. The small-scale setting of 2.5 people locked in a bathroom playing a game of Clue for their lives was surprisingly effective, and so were the whirly cam montage tricks used to show off other terror traps. So Saw opened the door to much more interest in exploring the sick, sad world of Jigsaw, especially after it ended on such a twist that it was decidedly not game over. The movie was still far from perfect, of course. The film had some moments of lazy acting and low-budget camera angling that are pretty cringeworthy upon review. But even if it didn't boast the slickest cinematography known to Hollywood, Saw was still an original and very disturbing abstraction for the auteurs to explore and was executed with impressive efficiency and invention. For those reasons, it's still the best. We'll just have to wait and see if the next sequel, Jigsaw, manages to bring some life back into the series. But until then,
Game over.
thanks for watching. Click the looper icon to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Plus, check out all this cool stuff we know you'll love too.